ash fell in slow, stubborn flakes, a false winter drifting over a city that had already burned. The cinders did not melt upon skin. They clung. They lay in the hair, in the creases of eyes, in the grooves of stone where dragonfire had crawled and set its teeth. Jon Snow pushed his way through the courtyard of the Red Keep, boots scuffing through soot so deep it swallowed the prince behind him. The sky beyond the shattered walls was a low bruise. Somewhere, a gull cried over the Blackwater and the sound flinched away from the ruined halls. He had not slept. Sleep had his face, though, and his hands. It had crept into the slump of his shoulders and made a home there. Ghost padded at his side. White coat made gray where the ash had kissed it. When Jon reached to lay a hand upon the direwolf's ruff, he felt the old, familiar steady breath. The pulse that meant there was something in this world that still remembered him without wanting to claim him. The palace gates had been hammered open by dragon heads. Now they hung like broken teeth. Men worked in silence along the path, bending their backs to lift char and body alike. A woman with a bare, soot-streaked arm clutched a swaddled bundle to her chest. There was nothing inside it now but cloth and air. She stepped aside for Jon as if he were a ghost cutting through the living. He kept his eyes forward and did not trust himself to speak a blessing, for he had none left that would not curdle in the throat. Davos Seaworth met him under the shadow of a fallen arch, his beard ash-salted, eyes red as if salt had stung them. "There you are," the Onion Knight said, voice pitched to keep from breaking. "It grows worse the higher you climb. Come before the wind turns and carries it back into our mouths." Jon nodded. The iron and smoke taste had already taken root at the base of his tongue. He followed Davos into the mangled belly of the keep. Through halls Jon remembered for banners and laughter and the whisper of silk, now made into a grave. Tyrion Lannister waited upon a fallen block of stone with his hands bound, a ring of unsullied around him, silent beneath their crested helms, their spears territorial as thorns. Tyrion's eyes found Jon with a gravity that made mockery of his light frame. "You came," he said, as if this had been a question he had not allowed himself to ask. "Do you come as the Queen's loyal servant or as a man who sees what is in front of him?" Jon felt the shift in the air when Davos looked away. Ghost's shoulders tensed beneath his hand. "Where is she?" Jon asked, though he knew. Tyrion looked upward, where the ceiling had been lanced open by tooth and flame. Through it the sky showed, a grim oval. "Gone," he said, "flown with her last faithful into a legend I doubt any will sing sweetly." "Drogon took her," Davos murmured, as if saying the dragon's name would compel it to swoop again from that wound in the sky. "He took her as gently as a mother lifts a child from a hearth. He took her and went." Jon closed his eyes. Behind their lids, the memory came in clean and merciless. A quiet place of stone and wind, a promise he had not wanted to break. The knife, the way her breath had left her as if weather leaking from a sky. The way the world had followed her, for a heartbeat, when she went. "Grey Worm won't be satisfied," Davos said. "He wants the rest. Justice if he sees it that way. Heads if he doesn't." Jon's jaw ached with the clench of it. "He'll have his justice," he said, because he could not say what he meant. That justice had eluded them all. Davos looked past him to the shadowed hall beyond. "Come," he said, the word a plea. "There's something you should see." The throne room had not collapsed. It had been scorched again, but the great pillars held with stubborn pride, and the high window had been made to resemble a shattered star. The iron throne still stood upon its dais, a nest of blades blackened into one harsh shape, its points duller where heat had kissed them, its bulk leaning as if the weight of all who had sought it had finally proven too much. Dust sifted in shafts of light like small ghosts. Gendry Baratheon was there before it, smeared with soot from brow to boot and with his hammer in his hand, but he was not working. He was looking like a man who had found the thing that had done him harm in childhood and discovered it smaller than his memory but meaner, too. "Lord Snow," he said, when Jon and Davos entered with Tyrion and their unsullied shadow. "They told me you were coming. I didn't think you'd come here." "Gendry," Jon said. He had not called the young smith by his new name, Lord of Storm's End, nor had Gendry offered it. The hammer looked right in his hand in a way the parchment had not. "How many?" Gendry asked. It was a child's question, blunt as his tool. It was the question that lived under all questions now. "Too many," Davos said. "More than can be counted with 10 fingers and both hands of every man in the realm." Gendry nodded once and set the hammer head upon the flagstones as if it were a hearth log and not a weapon. "I came to see it," he said, jerking his chin toward the throne. "The queen wanted it more than breath. She gave me a castle and made me a lord, and I didn't know whether to thank her or spit. Now there's no one left to thank, and spit chokes me." He looked at Jon. "What do we do with it?" Jon stepped toward the dais. He had stood here before, but only as shadow to another's light, as sentinel to a storm. The nearer he drew, the more the throne seemed a thing alive, a creature that had slept through fire and woke to hunger. He felt Tyrion's gaze, Davos's, the weight of 100 invisible eyes. Dead, maybe, or living, he could not tell. Ghost paced below the steps with a rumble that could have been warning. He reached and touched the iron. It was warm still, perversely warm, as if keeping memory of dragon heat. For an instant he thought of Aemon Targaryen's tales of kings cut and scarred by this throne to be reminded of their duty. He thought of children who had never been given the choice to be anything but instruments to a seat. He did not know what he believed about fate. He knew the dead. He knew the way cold bit bone. He knew the taste of blood when it rose and soured. He knew now the sound of a woman he had loved losing the last of her air. "Break it," he said. Gendry blinked, as if Jon had spoken in a tongue unknown to the 7 kingdoms. "What? Break it?" Jon said again, and did not raise his voice. He looked at Davos, at Tyrion, at the unsullied line whose captain's eyes glimmered beneath his helm like chips of old coal. "This thing has had us by the throat since it was born. It has done what old tales say dragons do. It has wanted, and it has burned, and it has taken. Break it, and we put the lie to it." "Grey Worm won't like that," Davos murmured. He barely rests his blade against a thing before he decides whether the blade should bite. Tyrion's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He may call it an insult to the memory of a queen who crossed the world to sit that seat. Jon looked up into the thrusting mass of swords. He saw there not a queen's dream but 1,000 small miseries riveted together. He turned and reached for Gendry's hammer. It came heavy into his hands, handle worn to the memory of the man who had made his life with it. He felt the ache in his shoulder that winter had left him, the pull in bone where old wounds had blossomed and healed. He went up the steps with the slow certainty of a man wading into water he knew to be cold. At the top he paused, breath turning the ash at his lips to paste, and then he drew back his arm and swung. The sound rang like a bell struck by a storm. It leapt up into the broken window and out across the crumbling keep, silver in the throat and iron in the belly. The first blow sent a shower of brittle shavings across the floor. The second made a seam split where blades had been fused by heat and time. Jon set his feet and swung again and again until the ache in his arms cramped into something close to rapture, until sparks spit and died around his boots and the iron mass groaned as if reluctant to remember what it felt like to be 100 separate swords. When he lowered the hammer, his chest sawed at the air. The black chair was split, its back broken, its crown fallen into the dust like a toppled idol. The Unsullied had not moved. Davos stood with a hand over his mouth. Gendry stared with an expression Jon could not read in full. Old rage, new hope, and a strange, boyish light that had nothing to do with kings. Ghost came up the steps and pressed his flank to Jon's leg. Jon put his hand to the direwolf's head and felt the shudder in both of them ease. Tyrion coughed ash from his throat. "There will be songs," he said softly. "Or curses. Perhaps both. People tend to make the same mistake with their stories as rulers do with their crowns. They forget who the people are." "They're the realm," Jon said. He looked beyond the splintered throne to the vast hall, where scaffolds of smoke hung and the ghost of old banners moved. He made himself say it. "Let the realm rule." Davos's eyes sharpened. "What are you thinking?" "No more kings," John said. The words came as if they had waited for his mouth to open for years and now leapt free. He tasted blood in them and bit down. No more crowns made of lies. No more saying the gods have picked someone's bones to sit upon the rest. Let the people who bled in these streets judge how they will be governed. Tyrion squinted at him. You will find that every hand is cleaner when it is picking someone else's purse. Then they must be taught to wash, Davos said, and there was the old iron humor of a sailor in his voice. What would you have them make, John? A council of fishwives and cut purses? The lords won't like it. The lords have liked too much, John said. They sat while the city burned, and they will sit while it rots, unless they are made to stand and carry. Let them stand beside the people they have fed and taxed and sent to die. Let them listen with their ears and not their walls. He looked at the Unsullied. Bring me Grey Worm. The captain came, iron silent. The heaviness of battle had not left his shoulders. His eyes were cinders. You murdered your queen, he said. He did not make a question of it. John felt the knife again. He forced himself to meet the man's gaze. I did what I did, he said. If your justice wants my head, take it. But hear me first. He gestured with a hand that still trembled from the hammer. I would give this realm back to itself. Nokins, a council chosen by the people and the lords together. The Unsullied have bled for a land that was not theirs because your queen asked you to believe in something. Believe in this instead. That if there is a fire in this city again, it will not be set by dragon or lord, but it will be the fires of kitchens and forges and the hearths of a people healing. Let your justice be what it will after that. Grey Worm's face did not change. One could imagine there was no face beneath the helm, only the narrow logic of a blade edge. He looked at the broken throne, at the iron shards lying like dead crows at its base. What you speak is weakness, he said. The strong make peace by making the weak stop breathing. Then the peace is a grave, Davos said. All of us in it sooner or later. The realm will hold our bones a while very handsomely, I'm sure. You want his head, Tyrion said. I understand it. There are debts to be paid. But if you cut off his head, where will the blood run? Down these steps into the street. You will teach the city that the last promise ever given to it is another red river. Then your men will be hunted down in time, and the women they lie with will be dishonored, and the children they make will wear stones for names. Or you can show that the queen's talk of a better world was not all ash. Let the man live until a council of the realm is made. Let that council judge. It is all I have to barter with you. Mercy in exchange for order. Grey Worm's breath hissed. You killed her, he said again, and John closed his eyes to it like a lash. The Unsullied looked to their captain, but their eyes flicked to the woman clutching her empty bundle behind them, to the old man on the floor with his hands wrapped around a cracked cup as if it contained the last of the sea. Men trained all their lives for commands are not immune to the sight of those they will be set among when the commands are over. Grey Worm said, one day, as if it cost him a tooth, one moon. If at the end of that time the people cannot choose, there will be no more talk. There will be justice. John inclined his head. He let out the breath he had not known he held. Agreed. Then begin, Grey Worm said. They began in the dragon pit, where once the city had housed its monsters and the bones of the monsters who had ridden them. The great circle of stone still stood, though the weeds had made a slow procession along its seats, little green banners in a conquered world. Davos and Tyrion labored as men labor to build a raft while the water is rising. They sent criers into the streets, banged upon doors, pulled survivors from cellars and peddlers from ruined market stalls. They offered food and a measure of safety to those who would sit and hear and be heard. Food bought attention better than proclamations ever could. John walked the city in that month with Ghost at his heels and Gendry at his back, and every day he found another name he had not known he carried in his chest. Long-legged Kella, who had run messages for the gold cloaks and now ran bread instead. Septon Benedar, whose all the gods were at last narrowed to a single prayer for clean water. The boy with the fish tattoo who said he understood boats and did not flinch when Davos put him to the test upon the Blackwater. They came in afraid and surly and hopeful. They learned how to sit without shouting, and how to stand without grabbing, and every day some of them returned and brought 2 more who said they would not. Tyrion stood upon a crate in the pit's shadow and talked. For once, not as a man performing himself, but as a man who wanted desperately to be understood. You have been ruled by men who told you that they spoke for your gods and your blood and your families, he said, ash still clinging stubbornly in his beard though he washed every night. Now speak for yourselves. For the first time, your breath will be the thing that makes the air move in this city. He set men and women to counting hands raised, to writing names, to arguing for the pleasure of argument and not war. The first time an old dyer's wife clambered up beside him and told him that his sums went crooked when the wind blew. He laughed and stepped aside for her ink-stained fingers. Samwell Tarly came with Gilly and little Sam upon his hip like a king carrying a scepter that muled. He looked older and broader in the shoulders, as if the West had added him slowly like another layer of wool. He had manuscripts salvaged from the Citadel's least proud stacks, texts that spoke of cities where men counted each other before they counted coins, of the triarchs of Volantis and the voting of Braavosi ship captains, of things that had not worked and the reasons why they had failed. He looked at Jon and his eyes were sore. I heard, he said. I was afraid I would be too late. You aren't, Jon said. And when Sam put his hand upon Jon's sleeve, he did not shrug it off, though something in him wanted to snarl that too much kindness would split him open and spill him on the floor. They rowed a charter by charcoal and candlelight while the sea sucked at the shattered keys like a dog at a broken bone. 21 speakers, Sam said, from the city's 7 districts, 3 from each, 1 chosen by those with a craft, 1 by those who sold their labor and had no guild, 1 seat for those who had none of the other 2. The fisherfolk on the mud gate side would select a woman or man to sit for them. The washerwomen along the street of silk would pick their voice. The remnants of the faith would choose someone to speak where the gods had once been a building. 7 more to come from the 7 kingdoms, once they could be convened. 1 from Dorne, 1 from the Stormlands, 1 from the Reach, the Rock, the Vale, the Riverlands, the Crownlands as they might one day be, and 2 for the North if the North accepted anything at all. 7 more still for the lords that remained. For Gendry with Storm's End upon his shoulders, for Bronze Yohn Royce, for Edmure Tully, for Robin Arryn if he had learned to stand upright under his new height. If you cut them out entirely, they will cut your throat behind closed doors, Tyrion said. Better to let them bring their knives where we can see the shine. And a steward, Davos added, scratching with a quill and proposing a seaman's order. Someone to carry the kettle without owning the kitchen. First steward of the people, Sam said. Not a king, not a queen. A thing anyone might become and might cease to be. Who? Gendry asked, blunt as his questions had always been. Not me, Jon said. The first assembly at the dragon pit swelled like a storm tide and broke and swelled again. Shouts shook the old stones. Songs clambered up where dragons had once roosted, harsh and knocked out of tune and beautiful because of it. Grey Worm stood at the top and watched with his jaw clenched so tight Jon thought the man might grind his own teeth to powder. The Dothraki circled upon their horses beyond the pit like storms unwilling to choose a shore. Yara Greyjoy came with a small knot of iron-born, mouth as sharp as a fisher's knife. Her hair smelled of the sea, and she walked as if the ground were only another temporary inconvenience between her and a ship. Bronn of the Blackwater swaggered in with 2 Tyrell men-at-arms, who looked unhappy at having fallen so far from the gardens to the ash. Edmure Tully arrived from the Riverlands blinking, as if the sun here had grown sharper in his absence. Robin Arryn dismounted from a pale horse and did not trip over his own feet once as he came down the steps. Bronze Yohn Royce trailed behind him, a warm paternal shadow with boulders for shoulders. They argued. Gods, how they argued. Yara wanted the islands recognized as free to raid and rule themselves within their salt-stained law. The Riverlands wanted their fields cleared of broken men and their fords rebuilt. The Vale wanted assurances that their mountains would not belch up winter before its time. Bronn wanted coin and grain and titles for the good of stability, by which one could hear he meant the good of Bronn. The washerwomen's speaker, a woman named Mara with sleeves forever damp to the elbow, wanted the laundries rebuilt with better drains, so their children would stop dying of water that should have been clean. A young man from the street of Smiths said he wouldn't speak at all if the city didn't pull nails from the ruined houses before they rotted into tetanus and took more men's hands than any queen had. Gendry rose then and said he would see to it, and when Bronn scoffed and asked whether a lord with a castle for a headboard had time to count nails, Gendry planted the hammer head on his own boot and stared at the sellsword until the man's laugh faded. "I will," he said, and it was not an oath of fealty, nor did it carry the weight of a fool's promise. It was a man telling the truth about what his hands could manage before they were called away to something else. Tyrion presided because there was no one else who could do it without turning every sentence into an insult. He kept the rhythm, widened the circle of voices when it threatened to narrow, and narrowed it when the circle became a mob. Sam sat at his side with a tally of names and votes and questions written down in a careful hand that still often smudged. Davos ran between groups like a harbor master guiding ships, gently bumping them apart when their hulls scraped, bringing messages of compromise, and when that failed, bread. Bread, Jon learned, solved tempers. Bread and water and a place to sleep in the lee of a half-fallen wall. Jon spoke when he had to and not otherwise. He did not trust himself to speak without bleeding, and he suspected that the bleeding would be a show the city could not afford. When he did, it was to say no, to say yes, to point to the broken throne hauled down from the keep into the dragon pit's heart. The Smiths had dragged the pieces there, sweating, cursing, laughing, and while the council argued, Jon had set Gendry and the others to work at the forge mouths that dotted the pit's belly, turning the swords into billets and the billets into nails, hinges, and, at last, the great iron bands that would hold the dragon pit's gates together when they built them anew. The night that the first of the gates swung on its hinges without shrieking made the city sing. Jon stood under the arch and watched people pass through. An old woman with a bundle of salvaged linens on her back like a snail with a home, 2 children carrying a cask between them and rolling it now and then for relief, a priest with the loose, careful steps of a man who had just learned how to walk again after a long illness. He felt each footfall in his chest and thought, "This is what it means to make something with hands." Grey Worm came to him there. "It is time," he said. "1 moon, you said." "You said," Jon corrected. He looked up at the dragon pit's repaired arch with its small sunrise of iron. "Have you ever heard that some birds return to their nests even after the nests have been burned?" Grey Worm's mouth did not bend. "The council will judge you. If you run, we hunt you. If they choose blood, I will take your head myself." Jon nodded. "I won't run. You will not speak in your own defense?" Grey Worm asked, and there was something almost puzzlement in his tone, as if he could not imagine the shape of this choice. Jon shook his head. "I've done enough with words. They will tear each other apart," Grey Worm said softly, and when Jon looked at him, he saw the man more clearly. Not a blade, not a set of commands wearing skin, but a human being hammered as thoroughly by the world as any iron before them. They are not trained. They are men and women. They are not meant to decide life and death. Soldiers decide. It is cleaner. A line. A head or not a head. "It's never been clean," Jon said. "You know that." Grey Worm looked away. "There was a woman," he said, and the surprise of it hit Jon like a stumble. "Her name was Missandei. She said, 'In the tongue of my people there is a word for when the war stops in a man before it stops in the world.' I thought it a pretty thing. Now I think it is like a bird that tries to nest in a fire." "Noth," Jon said. "You mean to go?" Grey Worm gave a short nod. "After," he said. "After there is an after." The council filled the dragon pit until the sound made the repaired gates hum. They sat in their mixed ranks. Fisherfolk beside lords, laundresses beside knights, a maester with his thin steel chains tucked like a gentleman's scarf beneath his robe. Sansa Stark arrived from the north, her hair the exact color of a certain kind of dusk. She brought Brienne of Tarth with her, steel glimmering not as threat but as promise. Behind them came men and women with the clean, cold look of winter's servants. Sansa did not sit at the upper ranks. She wove through the crowd and took a place among the people of the Mud Gate, who made space for her without truly knowing why, only feeling the pressure of a presence they wanted to please. She found Jon there, and for a moment all of the careful scaffolding he had built for his own heart creaked. There was the shape of Winterfell in her eyes, the taste of snow, the little girl who had once strung flowers, the woman who had once taken the North's rough grief and made a crown from it without once asking if she were allowed. She came close and did not embrace him. "Cousin," she said, because that was the story they had settled upon before the world had broken with the certainty of a frozen pond. "I heard." He nodded and could not say what he had done. "You look well. You look like a man who takes his own scolding well," she said, and her mouth bent. "Are you mad?" "More often," he said. She reached out, as if her hand meant to find his, and then laid her fingers instead upon Ghost's head. The dire wolf closed his eyes, accepting royalty like a cat. "The North will not bend," Sansa said, and there was apology in her voice and none. "We will not be ruled by anything that calls itself a throne, iron or otherwise." "This isn't that," Jon said. "You don't have to bend to sit beside." "I know," she said. "That is why I came." They judged him then, and it was worse than battle. Mara of the Laundries stood to say her sister had been taken with her children in a firestorm and never found. She said she had once cheered when a queen came to set them free, and that she had cheered too long and too loudly, and now there was char in her mouth where words should be. She said she would not let a man be killed for killing a woman who had killed so many. And then she sat down and closed her eyes and folded her hands until the skin between the knuckles went white. A man from the ragpicker's quarter stood and said he had seen the queen give bread to boys like him in Meereen, and that he had believed in her like a prayer made flesh, and he had followed her across the sea, and that now his faith lay in pieces. And what was a man supposed to do holding the shards of his God in his hands? The city heard him and was silent, and then began to murmur like a field when wind wakes it. Yara Greyjoy spoke and was brief and sharp. "You killed a queen," she said. "I have killed lords for less and laughed over their tables. But the sea swallows all kings. Let the man live to see if he can make a harbor where I will set my ships. If he makes a mockery of the wind, I will cut his throat myself to save the gods the trouble." The Ironborn beside her spread behind her like gulls. Edmure Tully rose and managed, in the space of 3 sentences, to propose himself as an excellent first steward, to weep and be embarrassed for weeping, and to sit down when Robin Arryn's hand upon his sleeve guided him like a cousin coaxing a drunk from a stool. Bronze Yohn Royce added a voice of granite. "The realm needed walls," he said, "not crowns. If the walls were built stoutly with many hands, they would stand longer than any king would sit." Sam read from their charter and stumbled only twice. He looked at Jon once and only once, when he read the line that said a steward would serve for a time long enough to be useful and not long enough to forget himself. Brienne stood by Sansa and did not speak. She watched the crowd move and settle with a knight's sense for lines of danger and ways to take an arrow before it found a good heart. Grey Worm rose last. He did not waste breath. "He killed my queen," he said. "I wanted his blood. I still want his blood. But my men have watched this place gather itself from ash like a crab from an old shell. If you kill him now, we go. If you banish him, we go. We will not be your scourge in your streets. You wanted to free the world of us. Thank your queen for it." The vote was made by hands, then by beans dropped in bowls that Davos had scoured and Sam had counted and Tyrion had roughed with a knife so that the grudging would not slip their fingers and cheat. It came close enough that, for a quarter hour, Jon thought the line between his neck and the blade would be all that history ever remembered of him. Then the line moved, and the bowl that meant banishment filled to a music of ceramic and exhalation. "You will go to the wall," Grey Worm said, as if he had always wanted to say it so he might put an end to it. "You will wear black and remember. There is no wall that matters anymore," Gendry said, not unkindly. "But there are places beyond it." Jon nodded. He had known. If the city had begged him to stay, he would have known. The future's shape had been pressed upon his skin all month long like the lines of a new sword upon a scabbard. A snugness, an inevitability, the promise of a blade near the ribs if he turned wrong. He went to Sansa that night under the repaired arch of the dragon pit where the air smelled of iron and sea and sweat. She stood with her cloak around her shoulders like a small winter. "You'll take the North and hold it," he said. "The North needs a queen who understands its stubbornness. The North needs a queen who knows when to forgive it its stubbornness," she said. "I will be that. Will you come?" He shook his head. When I close my eyes, the snow is clean, he said. When I open them, it's ash. I need a place where it is snow again. Or soil. He looked at her. You'll be splendid. You always were when you thought no one was watching. Now they will watch. They always watched, she said softly. They watched when I worried about needles and I did not know what a needle could be made to do. They watched when I lied to save myself. They watched when I learned to stop lying to save other people. She took his hand then and held it between both of hers, light and fierce. Do you forgive me? She asked, and he did not know for what. For growing up, perhaps. For believing in the North the way he had believed in a woman who burned cities. There's nothing to forgive, he said. Then forgive yourself, she said. He went to Arya in the dawn as she stood upon the quay with a ship that looked like a thought-made timber. She wore a cloak that was shorter than it should have been, as if she had cut it to stop it from catching at her hips. The wind played at her hair like a boy with a sister's braids. West, he said, and she smiled. Always, she said. If I stand still, I go mad. She touched his cheek with the knuckles of her hand as if trusting her fingertips would be too dangerous. If you find peace, keep it where I can steal it when I need to. If you find trouble, send it my way if it doesn't fit you. He laughed, and it felt like a thing that had needed oil. I will. Tyrion found him last with a bottle of something that had escaped the flames by hiding in the bottom of a cellar. He offered it, and Jon shook his head. I'm done with fire, he said. Tyrion inclined his head. I am to be first steward, Tyrion said. For a time, until they tire of my voice. They will tire of my voice faster than I will, which is a useful improvement on the way the world has always gone. You'll be good at it, Jon said. I will be what is needed, Tyrion said. And then I will try to be quiet. I have never been good at that. It will feel like being asked to hold water in my hands for a year. Perhaps it will teach me to cup them better. He looked at Jon a long while. I wronged you, he said. I wronged many. I thought I knew the size of my debt. Turns out to be a sea viewed from a cliff. I will build docks for it and pretend I am making something practical. Jon put his hand on Tyrion's shoulder, the first time he had touched the man since the chains. Build, he said. It's all there is left. Grey Worm and the Unsullied departed as they had arrived, in formation without banners, with a discipline that made the city's breath pause for a moment of admiration and resentment. The Dothraki went in smaller knots, some with them, some away into the reach where the fields might accept hooves and the women they took might teach them that not all taking need hurt. Yara took her ships and left the promise of grain from islands that had little, which meant her promise was honest. Bronn, for a marvel, oversaw the delivery of 3 storehouses of barley and did not steal more than a tenth. Davos moved the city's boats like chess pieces until the Blackwater glittered with nets rather than corpses. Sam took the rough letters of the charter to the Citadel and swallowed the insults and brought back a chainlet that said he had convinced at least one man with old ink that new words could be worth the metal they were written upon. They built the Hall of the People in the Dragon Pit out of stone that had not fallen and would dragged from houses that could not be saved. Children carried pebbles. Women carried timbers. Men carried stories. The hinges of the great doors were made from black iron hammered from the throne's crown. On the day the hall opened, they hung above the doors a small thing Tyrion had insisted upon. A bundle of hair ribbons and bells recovered from the bodies carried out of the ruins months ago, and beneath them, a plank carved with the words Sam had chosen. The realm belongs to the living. Jon put on black. Not the black of a sentence, but the black of a man who had decided that color freed him from being anyone but himself. He took Ghost and a horse that did not mind the wolf and rode north with a small party. Tormund Giantsbane, red as winter berries and laughing like a crack in ice. A woman from the Grid Street who claimed she had once been a baker and meant to teach wildlings to make bread that did not break teeth. 3 boys too young for any of it who refused to stay because they had no families left and had adopted one another instead. He rode beneath the broken towers of the wall and through the gate that had been repaired with wood and iron and stubbornness. He rode into a cold so clean it scrubbed the lungs. Beyond the wall the land waited with a patience the South had never had. Snow lay in hollows like folded cloth. Pines bore their burdens without creak or complaint. The free folk met them with spears and then with grins that showed the gaps war had made and the teeth life had left. They took John into their circles without speech, as if he had merely stepped away to piss and come back to warm his hands at the fire. Tormund thumped him on the back hard enough to jolt his old wounds awake. "You look like a man who made a mistake and then did something useful with it," Tormund said. "Good. Come. I've got wood that needs chopping and children that need scaring." He scooped one such child up, whirled him about until the boy squealed, and set him down with care only a father could have disguised. John built. He built huts and bridges and a small palisade against the kind of wolves that did not wear red eyes and old gods in their heads. He built a new rookery with poles that would not collapse under the weight of winter's first true snows. He built a weir of stones across a creek to make a pool where fish came to rest on their way to spawn, and he taught a boy with slow hands how to hold the net so that it lay upon the water like a thought. He built a hall out of log and skin where stories could be stored as if they were grain, and he told the story of a chair broken when small boys and old women asked him for the one he had to tell, and he made it as short and as long as it needed to be. In the spring beyond the wall being a looser, shyer thing than in the south. He stood outside the hall at dawn and watched fog move across the flats like a ground-hugging sky. Ghost ranged with two pups who had learned, inadvertently and to their permanent joy, that a dire wolf was a thing one could climb. Sam came to him there, near as he could for a week, and they walked along a ridge with snow still clinging to the shaded side. Sam told him news like a man who could not hold it without spilling. The hall of the people had weathered a fight so loud the doors had shaken with it, but at the end they had signed for the rebuilding of aqueducts and for fair weights to be regulated by women who knew better than men how heavy a thing felt when it had to be carried. A levy had been raised not by force but by example. They had put their coins into bowls and watched them stack. They had matched the piles with lists of projects, and at the end of the morning they had decided to raise another bowl. "I think they enjoy it," Sam said. "Not the part where their pockets are lighter. The part where they can point to a thing and say, 'I did that,' and have someone else nod." "And the North?" John asked and felt the old tug. "Queen Sansa held a moot at Winterfell," Sam said. "The lords came ready to shout and left ready to count their stores. She has the look of a woman who has learned to sleep with one eye open and both hands working. They have made deals with White Harbor that will keep the mountains in meat through winter, and a school has opened in the square where girls learn figures with boys. The hard men grumble, and then they find their daughters correcting the sums in their tallies and they stop." He smiled. "Brienne rides the passes like a story you tell children to keep them from getting lost. The wolf's head flies above the battlements, but under it there are new banners. A loom, a fish, a sheaf. Arya sent a bird from the sunset sea, said, sails, rocks, a sunset that takes an hour, a whale that sang. Tell him I have not fallen off the world. I will if it makes a better adventure." John laughed and it came easy. He looked toward the line where sky and land met and thought of a girl who had become a blade and then a boat. "And King's Landing?" First Steward Tyrion lost a vote by 3 beans and poured himself a cup of water and congratulated his opponent so loudly everyone laughed. "Gendry's nails hold. Mara's drains have cut the fever deaths by half. Davos taught boys on the quay to throw lines straight, and 2 of them signed on to ships bound for White Harbor with letters of introduction that make them beam like hearths. A plague came from the east and was caught at the gates with quarantine and care. Yara sent barrels of pickled herring and a letter saying if they didn't like it they could send back the barrels. Bronn is still Bronn. He counts every grain and occasionally forgets to note the ones that stick to his palm, but less often than you'd think. A Septon married 2 dockworkers under a lintel that used to be the arch of a lord's stable. The sun came through the repaired window in the hall and made a shape upon the floor that looked, if you squinted and believed, like a crown made of hands. Sam stopped and looked at John with the frankness of a man who has decided to live with his heart in his mouth. "It isn't perfect. It isn't supposed to be," John said. "Nothing is." He walked with Ghost into summer when summer came, the midsummer that the North calls by other names and the free folk simply call good. They hunted in thickets where the air smelled of pine resin and wet fir. They fished in pools where the water moved with the indifference of the large. He wrote sometimes to the hall, and his letters were short and unlovely, and Mara read them aloud just the same and said that a man who spoke a little but true was better than a song. He sent a dire wolf hair in one envelope, taped with wax to a sheet of parchment. Sam made a small face but kept it as if it were a relic. Autumn came, and with it men in the south who did not like the sound of other men making decisions without their leave. A petty lord near Blackhaven raised a banner painted with an old king's name and declared himself the rightful steward of his own hall at Sword Point. The hall of the people sent words instead of steel at first, and when words did, not by bread, they sent a levy of volunteers led by Brienne of Tarth and a knight from the Street of Flower who had kept his blade oiled and his temper better. They took no daughters and burned no barns. They did take the petty lord's sword and tied it upon his back and walked him barefoot to the hall, where he argued for the better part of a day and went away with a seat upon a committee for the regulation of harvest tithes. "If you make him count bushels, he'll forget to count men," Tyrion muttered, and Mara laughed through her nose. There were failures. A levy miscount left a hamlet without seed for the planting, and Tyrion took his cup into the square and let men and women shout at him until their throats were raw and their anger had burned clean to the wick of real grief. He made a joke at the end, because he could not help himself, and then told them he would ride himself to the Reach if he had to and return with seed in his beard. He returned with bags upon bags and a sunburn that made him wince under his hair and did not joke for a week. A fire took a row of houses when a baker fell asleep too close to his oven, and the hall made rules that half the city ignored and then came to obey when the fines were used to rebuild a bathhouse with tiles so blue they made children squeal. Winter came again. The north bent under it and did not break, because Sansa had taught it how to shift without losing shape. Jon went farther than he had meant to with Tormund and the boys who were no longer boys, and they found a valley where the wind went to rest, and in the valley a lake that remembered what mirrors should be. They built huts along its shore, and a row of poles with fish drying, and in the middle of it all, in a place where the frost never seemed to bite as hard, they planted a sapling that was not a weirwood and yet knocked at that old door with leaves. It grew slow and stubborn like hope. In the third year, when the autumn felt like it would last another 2 and the north went about its business with a dark content and the south's markets began to sound like laughter more often than shouting, a boy from the Vale came riding north with a letter in a tube of tin. He found Jon mending a net and swinging it like a dance to see if the pattern lay right. The boy's horse had the careful footwork of an animal taught by a hill. He dismounted with even better. "My lord," he said, and Jon remembers when such words could prick him. Now they lay flat. The letter had Tyrion's hand, spidering, precise. It spoke of small things and one not small at all. An election, Sam's word, and one the city had learned to say with pride, was coming for the first stewardship. Tyrion meant to lay down the burden. He had served for his promised times and a little more, as the charter allowed, when the winter had bitten deep in the second year. He had grown tired, he wrote, and old in a way that had nothing to do with the color of his hair. He wanted to sit upon a bench in a square and put bread crumbs upon his knee and pretend to forget to throw them so that pigeons might teach him patience. Who should take the stewardship? They asked him. The letter did not ask his blessing. It asked his knowledge. Jon read it and felt the old itch, the one that came before war. He looked down into himself and found that where once a chair had been waiting, now there was only a bench he had made with his own hands, and a place by the fire, and a woman with hair like copper, one of the free folk, who took him when he had no wish to be taken and kissed him when he had no wish to be kissed and had made for him a child who could not be his because he had given away the part of him that could father anyone. And yet when the boy toddled into his lap and called him Nan, because that was the syllable he could manage of Jon, he did not feel empty. He felt used, but in the good way, like a tool that has found its right work. He wrote back and said, "Choose the one who listens best to the voices you like least. Choose the one who can lose a vote and not mistake it for an insult. Choose the one who leans upon Sam for what he does not know and upon Davos for what he cannot stomach and upon Mara for what he cannot see. Choose the one who walks through the market without a guard and comes home with 3 new ideas and a bun for a child. Choose someone who can be tired without becoming cruel. Choose someone you do not love too well, for love makes people stupid, and this is a job for the intelligent." He sealed it with wax and sent it upon a bird so plump it looked like it had already eaten the letter. The hall chose. They chose a woman whose hands had scrubbed linens and lifted bodies and traced new sewers upon old maps. Mara of the laundries. She stood in the doorway under the iron hinges and bells and laughed when the bells caught in her hair. She spoke in a voice that had cut through steam and arguments for 20 years and told the realm that it did indeed belong to the living, and that the living had better sweep, because no one was coming with a broom. Davos cried and blamed the smoke from the forge. Sam wept without shame. Tyrion stood with a face Jon had never seen upon him, not even as a man or a lord or a prisoner. It was the face of someone who had been wronged by himself long enough and had forgiven the wrong. Not because he had earned it, but because the world needed him to be lighter. Years made themselves into a tapestry before Jon knew it, not smooth but tight. The North sent ships with furs and knives and girls with new letters in their mouths. The Reach sent grain. The Rock sent metal. Dorne sent wine that did not taste of soot and a delegation of women with veils like jokes. The islands sent salt and sorrow and their own bright music. A school rose in the city where small girls and small boys learned to add and to write their names and to argue without hitting first. A bakery opened where the baker's oath, written upon a board for all to see, promised to give the heel of each loaf to the hungriest child in the queue. A statue went up in a square of a tree that looked like a chair if you glanced at it and like a chair that looked like a tree if you looked too long. Brienne's keeps along the mountain roads took warmth and care and made them into safety. Arya's letters came once a year, then once every 2, and said less and less about oceans and more about towns and faces and the curious habit the world had of having people in it wherever you went. In the north beyond the wall, winter came long and tasted of the old story. It carved at cheeks and touched bones with small teeth. Children stuffed their sleeves with moss and their boots with hair and learned to laugh about it. They told the tale of the chair that had become doors. Jon listened and did not correct them. The sapling put out leaves shaped like a hand and then another, and the free folk began to bring to it the small offerings they had once brought to the weirwood tree that had stood near enough and far. Jon sometimes stood under it and felt the old god's gaze as you feel a bear's gaze in a wood, present, enormous, disinterested in your small errands and in love with everything that worked. On a day when the sun stood pale and yet bolder than you would think, Jon went to the lake at dawn to fish. The mist rose off it like breath. Ghost trotted ahead and then stopped and made the soft chuff that meant he had seen something that made him pleased. Jon squinted through the fog and made out a shape upon the far shore. A great, dark curve, a bar of shadow. For an instant, the old animal place in him prepared for a dragon, and then the fog pulled itself into tatters and he saw, not a dragon but a ship, small, the kind that could be rowed by 5 and sailed by 3. It wore a ragged flag that had once, perhaps, had a wolf upon it and now looked like a wet idea. In the prow stood a woman with a scar across her chin that had not been there when she left. Arya waved. "I found the edge," she shouted across water, which carries a lie and a truth alike. It wasn't a cliff. It was a door. He raised his hand and laughed and did not ask, because sometimes the shape of a family is the shape of a mystery you accept. She came ashore and smelled of salt and the unfamiliar stink of things that spend their lives beneath the sun and then roil up for a look. The free folk gathered and touched her cloak and grinned, and some of them tried to look unimpressed in the way of a people who have seen death and do not like to admit surprise. They feasted then on dried meat and fish as fat as cats and on a pie someone had made that tasted like memory and forgiveness. Arya told stories until the small ones fell asleep on each other and the big ones pretended they had not. She spoke of cities where the streets were laid in circles and the people left bread in the windowsills for spirits who ate badly. She spoke of islands where the trees grew fruit shaped like a baby's fist that you broke with a crack and wore like rings. She spoke of a man who knitted nets with his toes and a woman who could predict the weather by listening to rocks. She spoke of a child with hair the color of flowers that don't grow in the north and a laugh that made waves. Later, when the fire had burned down and the stars above the wall made a milk for the eye to drink, Arya leaned her shoulder against Jon's and said, "Soft, did you ever think we would get here?" "No," he said. "I didn't think. I only put one foot before the other. It turns out that if you do it long enough, you find a place where you're meant to stand." "You broke a chair," she said, and her voice had laughter and grief in it. "I did," he said. "Gendry broke it. I only borrowed his hammer." "Don't be small," she said. "You've done enough smallness." He looked toward the lake, where the mist had gone and the water lay, as his childhood had taught him to say, like glass. It did not look like glass. It looked like water, and that was better. "I still dream," he said, and she made a sound to say of course he did, and that she did too. "Sometimes I dream that I did not do it, that the chair is still there and the city is still burning and I am watching and cannot move. Then I wake and hear a child snore, and Ghost grouse at a flea, and Tormund curse because he rolled into the cold part of the bedroll." Arya smiled the private, sharp smile of a girl who once laid her first sword across her lap and decided never to put it down entirely. "You would have been a bad king," she said, teasing. "I would have," he said, truth like a blade that slides in and does its work without tearing. "I'm good at mending nets." "You're good at letting other people be good," she said. "That's rarer, and the city needed it more than it needed a man in a chair." She nudged him with her shoulder. "Mara sent you something." She handed him a bundle tied with twine. He opened it carefully because the habit of tearing was hard to undo, and it seemed a sin to tear something tied by those hands. Inside lay a square of cloth with a pattern braided upon it in red and blue and black. The colors were not chosen for beauty exactly, but they sat together with the stubborn harmony of neighbors who had decided to stop fighting in order to get a wall built. The pattern was a chair that was a tree, or a tree that was a chair, depending on how you squinted. Along the bottom, in a hand that was not used to sewing but had decided to learn anyway, were the words, "For the man who broke it so we could sit." He folded it and felt the cloth heavy with a workmanship that had held bodies and babies and the dead. "She's the steward," he said, as if Arya did not know. "She doesn't need to send me presents." "She needs to remind you," Arya said. They slept that night under the roof he had built out of logs he had hewn, and on a bed he had made out of straw he had cut and rope he had twisted. The world turned. In the morning children went to fetch water and came back with faces wet from falling in, laughing. Men and women took up axes and plows and nets and spears and set to it, because a morning is a bell whether it rings or not. In the city the hall opened its doors, and the first thing the steward did was check the drains, as was her habit, because a city collapses from the bottom before it collapses from the top. In Winterfell Sansa sat beneath a white sky with her hands open in her lap and heard a supplicant tell a lie and decided to make of it a truth the woman could live with. Gendry struck at an iron bar until it sang and then struck again until the high note came that meant he could stop. Tyrion threw crumbs and learned patience. Sam translated a text so old the letters had forgotten they used to be pictures. Davos taught a girl to tie a bowline and did not cry when she did it correctly the first time. Yara laughed at something obscene and drank something stronger and counted the hulls in her harbor and scowled at the holes and set about filling them without complaining. Brienne sat by a roadside fire and sharpened her sword and looked up at the stars and said the names of the people she had sworn to protect and felt, as she said them, that the list had grown beyond men and women to include the small and the hungry and the rain barrel and the bridge. Jon woke and walked and mended and talked. He let the children climb Ghost when Ghost allowed it and rescued the children when Ghost did not. He stood sometimes at the edge of the lake and watched the sky grow old, then young, then old again. He thought of the chair that had held all their necks for so long, and he felt, still, the echo in his bones from the day the hammer had made a music of iron. The echo had become a note he could live by, like a drone beneath a song. He hummed to it sometimes without realizing, and the woman with hair the color of copper teased him and said he had the ear of a fish and the heart of a bear and the hands of a farmer, and he pretended to be wounded and she made him soup. One day in late summer, or what the free folk called late summer, which would have been deep spring anywhere else, a boy brought a drum he had made from hide stretched across a hoop of willow. He beat at it with both hands and then with a stick and then with his palms again, searching for the noise he wanted. Jon listened and said nothing for a while, and then he took the hammer he had used to spread rivets and gently tapped the side of the drum to show the boy where to find the note that would hold the others in a line. The boy tried, failed, tried again, and found it. and the look upon his face made John feel as if he had been given back time he had once wasted. That night the boy sat in the hall and beat his drum while the village sang, and the song moved across the valley like fog. Years made a long braid. The hall elected and unelected stewards. Sometimes they chose well, sometimes less so. When they chose poorly, the city learned faster. A man put his hand into the till and withdrew it burned. A woman wielded her new power as if it were the hammer she had needed to knock her past into shape and bruised everything she touched before she learned to hold and not to hit. A flood took the lower keys and did not take as many lives as such floods had once taken. A monument rose in the square with no horse beneath it. Only a pair of joined hands over a basin consistently kept filled with clean water. Children learned to count beans and then to put them back when they had been counted. No bards came to the lake beyond the wall to sing for Jon Snow. He did not want them to. Bards, he had learned, made flat songs from complicated lives because songs like that were easier to remember. He would have preferred not to be remembered at all, if the choice had been his. But choice had never been his to keep, not really. Once a season a letter came to the hall that said only, "We are alive and well. How are you?" It was written in a hand that grew more confident over time. Sometimes the letters carried a pressed thing. A leaf, a fish scale, a lock of hair from a child named for no one. Once, just once, a single link of black iron came wrapped in cloth and a note that said, the last of it turned into bridges and hinges and door latches. Felt good in his palm, solid and simple, an old promise finally kept. When his hair went white as small frost upon a rock, and the boy who had called him Nan could carry 2 deer upon his shoulders and still find time to give a hand to old men rising from their chairs, Jon Snow stood upon the ridge above the lake and watched the light slide over the world. The wall in the far distance crouched like a sleeping beast. It would never wake again in the way it once had. He did not regret it. The song of the drum moved through the evening and slowed. He put his hand upon Ghost, who had grown thin because time eats, and felt the dog's slow breath. He closed his eyes and saw an iron chair breaking, and heard the sound again that had carried into the hall and filled the city, and felt the hammer head bite into his palm, and watched the pieces fall and be made into hinges and nails and things that served. He opened his eyes and saw children spilling into the shallows like trout, sleek and flashing. He laughed, and it ran down the slope ahead of him and made pebbles hop. The wind shifted. From the south it carried tar and bread and the bray of a donkey. From the east it carried salt. From the west it carried, faint and delighted, the sound of a woman telling a story about a cliff that turned into a door. From the north it brought nothing, which in that place meant peace. He did not know whether the world had been saved. He did not know whether it could be. He knew only that the men and women in it had taken, at last, their own weight upon their own bones, and that some had found themselves stronger than they had imagined. He knew only that a throne had been broken and a hall had been built and that doors swung on hinges made from the past. He knew only that the realm belonged to the living, and that he was one of them for a little while yet, and that this was enough.